In Red Hook, Brooklyn, where sea salt rides the wind and money builds towers across the water, a single mother inherits a charred house and the laughter of those who think ruin is all she deserves. Stay close. What begins with scorn turns into quiet courage and consequences of the heart. Subscribe, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. The municipal office on Livingston Street hummed with old fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally, casting shadows across worn linoleum floors. Elena Morales stood at the counter, her fingers wrapped around a plastic folder gone soft at the corners from being carried everywhere for weeks. The folder contained her entire future, a deed to a property she never expected to own. Outside, sirens wailed through the December air, a constant reminder of city life continuing despite personal upheavals. Inside, a wall clock ticked loudly, each second punctuating the weight of the decision before her. Elena pulled her thrifted winter coat tighter around her thin frame. The room smelled of toner, burnt coffee, and the faint cologne of the man standing next to her, Brandon Vale, a developer whose presence seemed to fill more space than his body occupied. "You really want to take title?" Brandon asked, tapping a glossy brochure against the marble countertop. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "It's a teardown." Insurance nightmare. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of mint and something sharper. "Sign the release and I'll make sure you get a little something for the trouble." Elena glanced down at the deed in her hands. 72 Van Brunt Street. The house was blackened by an electrical fire just weeks earlier, left to her by Mr. Klein, the elderly widower whose groceries she'd carried every Wednesday for the past 3 years. The same man whose back steps she mopped when summer heat turned the neighborhood into a sweltering maze of concrete and metal. She could still taste smoke at the back of her throat when she thought about the house, like pennies and ash mingling on her tongue. Her daughter Sophia, 8 years old with eyes that missed nothing, pressed against her side. The child's wool hat smelled of laundry soap and the strawberry shampoo Elena had splurged on last month. Sophia's small hand found Elena's, squeezing with quiet reassurance. A clerk nearby stapled forms with bored precision, the metallic chunk of the stapler punctuating the silence. The radiator in the corner hissed and clanked, pushing out heat that never quite reached the center of the room. Elena's hands shook as she reviewed the paperwork, not from cold, but from memory. Eviction notices slipped under doors at midnight, second shifts that left her fingers raw, the feel of bus rails sticky with gum as she commuted between jobs. The pen felt heavy as she signed her name, the scratch of ballpoint against paper audible in the quiet room. The room seemed to inhale as she completed the signature. Brandon's laugh was quiet, a sound like silk over steel. "Congratulations on your toasted asset," he said, adjusting his navy blazer with manicured fingers. "When you're ready to sell, and you will be, call me first." He slid a business card across the counter, the embossed letters catching the fluorescent light. Elena slid the deed back into the folder and lifted her chin. Words hung in the air between them, barbed, glittering with unspoken challenge, and then fell into a silence so dense it felt like snowfall no one had bothered to announce. "Thank you for your concern," she finally said, her accent curling around the words with quiet dignity. "But Mr. Klein wanted me to have this house. I will honor his wish." Brandon's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in his eyes, annoyance perhaps, or recalculation. "Noble sentiment. Let's see how long it lasts when the bills start coming." He turned away, shoes clicking against the floor as he departed, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and dismissal. The clerk pushed the final paperwork toward Elena with a tired smile. "All set, Ms. Morales, property's yours now, for better or worse." Outside, the wind cut through Elena's coat as she and Sophia walked toward the bus stop. Gray clouds hung low, threatening snow or freezing rain. The neighborhood around them was changing. New coffee shops with $5 lattes stood beside decades-old hardware stores with handwritten signs. Construction scaffolding wrapped buildings like bandages, hiding the transformation happening beneath. "Is our house very broken, Mama?" Sophia asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. Yes, mija. The fire hurt it badly. Can we fix it? The bus shelter offered little protection from the wind that whistled through cracks in the plexiglass. Elena crouched down to Sophia's level, brushing a strand of dark hair from her daughter's face. I don't know, she admitted. It will be very hard. Very expensive. Sophia nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. But it's ours now. Mr. Klein gave it to us because you were kind to him when nobody else was. The memory washed over Elena. Mr. Klein stooped and soft-spoken, pressing the key into her hand the week before he passed. You made an old man feel human, he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. That house needs someone who understands what home really means. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes and a cloud of exhaust that smelled of diesel in winter. As they climbed aboard, Elena felt the weight of the folder in her hand, heavier than paper had any right to be, filled with possibility and burden in equal measure. That night in their basement apartment with its perpetually damp corners and walls, thin enough to hear neighbors' arguments, Elena sat at the kitchen table after Sophia had gone to bed. She spread the paperwork across the scratched surface, the deed to 72 Van Brunt Street staring back at her like a challenge. The pipes gurgled and clinked in the walls. Outside, someone's car alarm wailed briefly before falling silent. Elena traced her fingers over Mr. Klein's address, now her address, and thought about what it meant to own something broken, something that others had deemed worthless. Her mother had taught her that nothing was truly beyond repair if you cared enough to try. But care required resources, and resources were exactly what Elena lacked. The late-night cleaning shifts at the office building downtown barely covered their current rent. The weekend hours at the laundromat supplemented groceries and Sophia's school supplies. There was nothing left over for renovating a fire-damaged house. Yet something in her refused to surrender to Brandon Vale's certainty that she would fail. Perhaps it was the memory of Meister Klein's trust in her, or the weight of Sophia's hope. Perhaps it was simply the stubborn determination that had carried her through every previous hardship. Elena gathered the papers back into the folder. Tomorrow, she decided, they would visit their house, their damaged, broken, possibilities-filled house, and see exactly what they had inherited. Home was a basement apartment off Columbia Street that always smelled faintly of damp plaster and cumin from Mrs. Ortiz's kitchen upstairs. The radiator clicked like old teeth, pipes singing at odd hours like a restless child. Elena brewed coffee in a dented mocha pot and watched steam ribbon toward a ceiling stain the color of weak tea. Morning light struggled through the single window, filtering past the metal grate that protected it from the sidewalk above. On the windowsill sat a cracked snow globe of Coney Island, a boardwalk in miniature, the cyclone roller coaster tilted beneath a web of fractures that caught the light. Her mother had bought it for her when Elena was 12, the summer they'd ridden the subway with warm bagels wrapped in wax paper. Shake it, her mother had said, eyes crinkling at the corners. Even broken, it still snows. Life had been a long shake since then. Elena cleaned corporate offices at night, the vacuum's drone a constant companion as she emptied trash bins and wiped fingerprints from glass doors. Weekends found her at Suds and Duds laundromat, folding other people's clothes into neat squares while Sophia did homework at a wobbly table in the corner. The smell of detergent and fabric softener had become so familiar that Elena could identify brands by scent alone. She kept a grocery ledger and pencil, writing small to make numbers behave. Milk, bread, eggs, apples. The essentials competed with Sophia's growing feet and the asthma medication that insurance only partially covered. Elena balanced the checkbook with mathematical precision, allowing herself only one luxury: the occasional paperback book from the secondhand store that smelled of dust and other people's journeys. Years back, Sophia's father left a note and disappeared into another city. Elena had balanced grief with coupons and lullabies. It's just us now, she'd whispered to the infant Sophia, whose eyelashes cast tiny shadows on plump cheeks. But we are enough. Most mornings began with the sound of gulls and the slow brightness of the waterfront. Most nights ended with Elena rubbing balm into her aching wrists while Sophia read aloud from library books, her voice soft as rain against windows. Mr. Klein had noticed them, truly noticed them, when most of the neighborhood saw right through. A retired photographer with arthritic hands and cloudy eyes, he'd watch from his stoop as Elena and Sophia walked to the bus stop. One morning, he'd called them over, voice wavering but determined. "My paper never comes anymore," he'd said, dignity wrapped around him like an old but immaculate coat. "Could you check for me when you pass?" "I'll pay you, of course." It wasn't the money, which was modest, but the way he spoke to them. Not with pity or dismissal, but with the courtesy of equals. Elena had helped him sort mail without hovering, steadied his arm without pitying, listened to stories of old Brooklyn when he needed to remember. Sophia would arrange his pill bottles in rainbow order and read headlines from the newspaper, her pronunciation careful around difficult words. "You and Sophia make a place feel like morning," he'd said once, handing Sophia a peppermint that tasted like winter and rosemary. His walls were lined with photographs, protests, workers, children laughing, each one a moment of humanity all preserved. The snow globe's water was cloudy now, and a grain of glitter clung stubbornly to the cyclone's peak like a small, stubborn star. Elena touched the glass, remembering how Mr. Klein had left her the house because she'd left him dignity, the most precious currency. Despite the soot and the skepticism, she believed in movement quieter than luck, in kindness that circled back like certain birds returning to familiar trees. Sophia padded into the kitchen, hair tangled from sleep, wearing mismatched socks, one with unicorns, one striped. "Are we going to see our house today?" she asked, voice still husky with dreams. Elena poured cereal into a chipped bowl. "Yes, after breakfast." "Will it be very sad?" The question hung in the air alongside steam from the coffee. Elena chose her words carefully. "It will be damaged, but damage isn't the same as destroyed." Sophia nodded, spooning cereal thoughtfully. "Like your snow globe. It's cracked, but it still works." Outside, a garbage truck grumbled past, the hydraulic whine of its compactor cutting through the morning quiet. Mrs. Ortiz's radio upstairs played a salsa tune, the bass thumping through the ceiling. Life continued its rhythm all around them, indifferent to decisions and inheritances. After breakfast, they bundled against the December cold. Sophia in a coat she'd outgrown slightly, the sleeves revealing a half-inch of sweater. Elena in her thrifted wool with mismatched buttons she'd carefully sewn on herself. They took the bus to Red Hook, the vehicle sighing as it navigated narrow streets lined with warehouses and auto repair shops. Van Brunt Street appeared unchanged from yesterday, from last year, from decades past. Industrial buildings with peeling paint stood alongside renovated condos with shining windows. The contrast was Brooklyn itself, a patchwork of persistence and transformation sewn together by sidewalks and ambition. Number 72 was a narrow brownstone squeezed between a bodega and another residence. From outside, the damage wasn't immediately visible, just a darkening around the upper windows like smudged mascara. Elena fished the key from her pocket. It felt impossibly heavy for such a small object. "Can I hold it?" Sophia asked. Elena placed the key in her daughter's palm. Sophia examined it with reverence, running her finger along the teeth. "It looks like a normal key." "But it opens our house." "Our house," Elena repeated, the words strange on her tongue. In 32 years, she had never owned anything larger than a suitcase. The lock turned with reluctance, a scrape of metal against metal that needed oil and patience. The door swung inward with a groan of hinges. Inside, the smell hit them first. Wet ash and cold plaster, a sour mixture that clung to the back of the throat. The floor was gritty with soot beneath their feet. Light filtered through windows clouded by smoke damage, casting the interior in a gray haze. Water stains mapped the walls where firefighters had doused flames. Thin, icy veins trailed down to baseboards warped by moisture. The kitchen tiles were cracked like shells washed ashore. The refrigerator wore a coat of black soot. When Elena stepped further in, the floor sighed beneath her weight. Sophia stayed close, small boots whispering over the debris. Her breath fogged in the cold air like a tiny cloud. "It's very dark," Sophia whispered, squeezing Elena's hand. "The electricity is off," Elena explained, "and the windows need cleaning." They moved carefully through the first floor. Despite the damage, the structure remained. Doorways stood square. Stairs held firm, the skeleton of the house intact beneath its wounded skin. Elena ran her fingers along a wall, feeling the solidity beneath the soot. The grime transferred to her fingertips, leaving ghostly prints on everything she touched. Through a doorway, sunlight suddenly pierced through a cleaner section of window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The beam caught a framed photograph that had somehow survived, hanging crookedly on the living room wall. One of Mr. Klein's images showing the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn, light breaking over Manhattan beyond. Sophia pointed. "Look, Mama. The picture isn't burned." Elena straightened the frame with gentle hands. "No, it survived." They didn't see Brandon Vale in person, but they heard his voice from the sidewalk, slick and amused, talking to someone whose scarf cost more than Elena's monthly rent. The words drifted through a cracked window pane. "Hold off on the demo permit submissions," Brandon said. "She'll cave once the fines stack." Everyone caves to math. Math, Elena thought, could be cruel indeed. She counted bills in her head, rent due in 2 weeks, the boiler failing in the basement apartment, Sophia's asthma inhaler almost empty. Her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the lingering smoke. That night, a second notice arrived at home. A rent increase, due to neighborhood improvements. The paper rasped in her fingers, as if trying to wriggle free. If they lost the apartment while the house was condemned, there would be nowhere to go. The shelter system was overwhelmed, and Elena had seen too many families split apart by well-meaning regulations. She would not let that happen to Sophia, not while she had breath in her body and strength in her hands. After Sophia fell asleep, Elena sat at the small table, tracing cracks in the laminate like roads on a map. She closed her eyes and listened. Distant barge horns, a neighbor's TV through the wall, the fat drops of a thaw starting outside. A memory floated up. Mr. Klein's cough, then his laugh, then a phrase repeated on one of her last visits. "Under the steps, that's where I keep what matters." She'd thought he meant spare keys or old shoes, practical things an elderly man might stash away. The words returned now with the weight of something more. A clue, perhaps, or a promise. The next morning, when the light pooled like thin milk on the sidewalk, she took a crowbar and went back to 72 Van Brunt Street with Sophia by her side. The front steps of 72 Van Brunt Street were scarred, each riser streaked with soot like mascara after weeping. The December morning arrived reluctantly, the sky a pale gray ceiling above brownstones and warehouses. The air smelled of salt from the nearby harbor, mixed with car exhaust and someone's breakfast bacon frying 3 doors down. Elena knelt on the cold concrete, the crowbar heavy in her gloved hands. Her knees ached immediately, the cold biting through her jeans like tiny teeth. On the door behind them, an orange notice fluttered, corners lifted by the winter wind. Unsafe structure. Repair or demolish within 30 days. The paper carried a bitter taste when the air blew particles toward Elena's mouth. "What are we looking for?" Sophia asked, her voice small in the vastness of the damaged house. She crouched beside her mother, her breath sweet with the peppermint candy Mrs. Ortiz had given her that morning. "I'm not sure," Elena admitted, examining the wooden stairs. "Mr. Klein said he kept important things under the steps." The crowbar slipped against the wood, metal squealing against damp grain. Elena repositioned, muscles straining as she applied pressure to the edge of one tread. Sophia leaned closer, reaching out to tap one step with a mittened knuckle. "Mom, listen," she whispered. The sound was hollow, softer than the others, like a drum with a hand resting on the skin. Elena shifted her attention to that step, working the crowbar's edge carefully into the seam where the riser met the tread. "Good ear, mija," she murmured, pride warming her voice despite the chill. They pried gently, not wanting to cause more damage to the already wounded house. Nails protested with tiny screams. Splinters perfumed the air with the ghost of pine. Beneath the tread lay a shallow cavity lined with tin, like an old cookie box flattened and repurposed. In it, a fireproof box sat like a stubborn heart, the metal blackened but intact. Elena's knuckles were raw when the latch finally surrendered with a click that sounded too bright for the ruined room. She looked at Sophia, whose eyes were wide with anticipation, before lifting the lid. Inside, a stack of manila envelopes, edges crisp despite the surrounding damage, and a cloth bundle that smelled faintly of camphor and lingering smoke. Elena unfolded the first letter with careful fingers. The paper was heavy, official-looking, with letterhead from institutions whose names made her pulse quicken. Greenpoint Gallery, Museum of the City of New York, Smithsonian. Ink had bled in places but held its ground, the words still legible. Names leaped from the pages like sparrows taking flight. Marvin Klein, licensing agreements, royalties, archives. There were contracts, proper, notarized, stamped in blue, and a short note in Mr. Klein's slanted handwriting addressed to her. Elena, it read, you returned to me a kind of light that fades for many old men left alone. If you're reading this, the pictures are yours now, and the rights to them too. They told the story of people who weren't looked at. I want them to tell yours now, in a different way. Sophia unwrapped the cloth bundle, her small fingers working with the care of someone handling a bird's nest. Negatives slept inside like strips of night. Contact sheets fluttered with images. Protests on Flatbush Avenue from decades past. A nurse on strike outside a hospital. A Puerto Rican grandmother laughing under laundry lines strung between buildings. A dock worker's hands knotted like rope from years of labor. History breathed up from the soot, preserved in silver and light. The last envelope held a recent appraisal. Numbers that made Elena dizzy. An amount with commas like small white doors all opening at once. The collection, according to the document, was historically significant and of considerable artistic and documentary value. Sophia's eyes shone, reflecting the pale winter sun that crept in through the broken window. He wanted you to have these, she said, voice round with certainty beyond her years. Because you saw him when nobody else did. Elena pressed the paper to her chest. The house still smelled like loss, but under the ash something warm threaded the air. Cedar, old paper, the beginning of possibility like bread rising in an oven. Long thought cold. They gathered everything carefully, placing the contents back in the fireproof box. Through the window, Elena noticed Brandon Vale walking on the opposite sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing emphatically. His voice carried in fragments, timeline and demolition and neighborhood character. Elena's phone vibrated in her pocket, her supervisor at the office cleaning job, asking if she could cover an extra shift that night. The thought of more hours on her feet made her bones ache preemptively, but the rent increase notice flashed in her mind. She texted back a simple yes, wondering if Mrs. Ortiz would watch Sophia again. That afternoon, they visited the small museum in DUMBO that was mentioned in one of the letters. The building was brick and glass, with polished concrete floors that amplified footsteps into echoes. The curator, a woman named Amara with silver-streaked hair and glasses that caught the light, examined the contact sheets with reverent hands. "These are extraordinary," she said, voice hushed as if in church. "Marvin Klein's work has been sought after by institutions for years. We displayed some of his civil rights photography in 2018. She looked up at Elena. "How did you come to have these?" Elena explained about Mr. Klein, about carrying groceries and sorting mail, about dignity as currency. She didn't mention the fire or Brandon Vale or the orange notice threatening demolition. Some vulnerabilities were too raw to expose to strangers, however kind they seemed. Amara nodded slowly. "We would be very interested in discussing an exhibition, and these documents," she gestured to the contracts, "suggest you hold the rights to reproduce and license these images." She named a figure that made Elena's hands tremble. That would be our starting offer for a limited publication run alongside the exhibition. Outside the museum, Sophia skipped along the cobblestone street, energized by the excitement of adults talking about possibilities. Are we rich now? She asked, the word rich carrying the weight of childhood dreams. Ice cream whenever you wanted, shoes without holes, heat that worked consistently. Elena shook her head. Not rich. But we have options we didn't have yesterday. The bus back to their neighborhood rattled and swayed, windows fogging with the breath of tired commuters heading home. Elena stared at the passing warehouses turned into luxury lofts, the new coffee shops with hand-lettered signs, the construction sites promising luxury waterfront living. Brooklyn was changing, had always been changing. The only constant was transformation itself. At home, Elena made dinner, rice and beans with the last of the chicken, stretched to feed them for 2 nights. The basement apartment felt smaller after visiting the house on Van Brunt Street. The ceiling lower, the walls closer, or perhaps it was Elena's perspective that had shifted, expanded by possibility. Sophia set the table, carefully placing forks on folded paper towels. Can we fix our house, Mama? Make it not burned anymore? Elena stirred the pot slowly, watching steam rise like prayers. It would take a lot of money, more than we have right now. But we have Mr. Klein's pictures. The museum lady said they're worth something. Yes, but fixing a house costs even more. Elena didn't share the full weight of what she knew. That beyond repairs, there would be permits, inspections, property taxes, insurance. The arithmetic of ownership was complex and unforgiving. After dinner, while Sophia did homework at the small table, Elena called her sister in Florida. Maria had left Brooklyn years ago for the promise of sunshine and lower rent, her voice now carrying the slight softening of consonants that came from living in the South. A house? Dios mío, Elena, that's incredible, Maria said when Elena explained. The phone connection crackled with distance. But a fire? Can you afford to fix it? I don't know, Elena admitted, keeping her voice low so Sophia wouldn't hear the uncertainty. But there's something else. She described the photographs, the appraisal, the curator's interest. Maria was quiet for a moment. Mama always said kindness comes back with interest, she finally replied. Remember how she used to leave Cafecito for the mail carrier, even when we barely had coffee for ourselves? The memory was a warm stone in Elena's chest. Their mother had been gone for 12 years, but her lessons lingered like perfume in empty rooms. That night, a second notice arrived, slipped under their door by the landlord's assistant, who never made eye contact. This one was more explicit. Rent would increase by 30% in 60 days, reflective of market conditions. The paper felt thinner than it should, as if embarrassed by its own message. Elena placed it beside the first notice, then beside the curator's business card, then beside the key to 72 Van Brunt Street. She arranged them in a row on the small table, physical manifestations of pressure and possibility laid out like tarot cards. If they lost the apartment while the house remained condemned, there would be nowhere. If they invested everything in repairs but missed some critical requirement, there would be nothing left. If they sold the photographs but Brandon Vale somehow secured demolition permits first, there would be only regret. The weight of decisions pressed on her shoulders as she prepared for her night shift, changing into the gray uniform that smelled perpetually of industrial cleaner. Sophia was already asleep on the pull-out couch, her face soft in dreams, unaware of the crossroads her mother stood at. Before leaving, Elena paused at the windowsill, touching the cracked snow globe gently. She shook it, watching the white flakes swirl around the miniature cyclone. Even broken, it still snowed. Even damaged, things could be beautiful. The next morning, they returned to the house with purpose and a plan that had formed in Elena's mind during hours of vacuuming corporate hallways. The orange demolition notice flapped on the door like a challenge. Inside, they headed straight for the kitchen, where Elena knelt on the floor, examining the ancient linoleum. "What are we looking for now?" Sophia asked, her curiosity undimmed by yesterday's discovery. Elena ran her fingers along the edge where floor met wall. Mr. Klein told me once that in these old houses, people sometimes hid things under the kitchen floor. During Prohibition, or later, during hard times. Things they wanted to keep safe. Sophia's eyes widened. Like treasure? Elena smiled, the expression warming her tired face. Maybe not gold coins. But yes, like treasure. Things that matter. Word traveled along the waterfront faster than tide. By afternoon, Elena's phone buzzed with messages from neighbors she barely knew. Mrs. Ortiz had told her cousin who worked at the bodega, who mentioned it to the school secretary, whose brother had studied photography at Pratt. Brooklyn's invisible network, woven from snippets of conversation at bus stops and bodegas, hummed with news of Marvin Klein's discovered collection. Elena stood in the kitchen of 72 Van Brunt Street, examining the linoleum that curled slightly at the edges. Sophia had brought a small flashlight from her backpack, the beam dancing across the stained floor as she moved around the room. "How do we know where to look?" Sophia asked, crouching to examine a patch of flooring that seemed less faded than the rest. The kitchen smelled of old grease and water damage, with undertones of something acidic, cleaning products from decades past perhaps, or chemicals from the firefighters' efforts. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past, the hydraulic hiss of its brakes punctuating the morning. Elena knelt beside a section where the floor pattern shifted slightly, the squares misaligned by mere millimeters. She ran her fingers along the seam, feeling for any give. Mr. Klein said, "Old houses keep secrets," she murmured. "We look for the places that don't match." The crowbar slipped between linoleum and subfloor with reluctance, the adhesive groaning as decades-old bonds separated. Sophia watched with wide eyes as Elena worked. The muscles in her mother's arms taut with effort. When the floor covering finally peeled back, it revealed wooden planks beneath, darker at the edges where moisture had seeped in. One board seemed different, slightly newer, the grain not quite matching its neighbors. Elena worked the crowbar into the gap at its edge, pressing down with controlled force. The board lifted with a creak of protest, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside lay a metal box similar to the one from under the steps, though smaller and more weathered. Elena lifted it carefully, setting it on the counter with reverent hands. The latch was simple, unfastened, as if the person who placed it there had expected it to be found sooner. Inside were no contracts or negatives, but something equally precious. A leather-bound journal with yellowed pages, a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them, an envelope containing old currency, bills in denominations no longer printed, their edges soft with age. "Treasure," Sophia whispered, her face solemn with discovery. Elena opened the journal carefully. The handwriting inside wasn't Mr. Klein's angular script, but something rounder, more flowing. The first page bore a name, Margaret Klein, 1968. Mr. Klein's wife, whose photographs lined the hallway upstairs, a woman with kind eyes and a determined mouth who had died before Elena ever met him. The journal documented the house's history, renovations made in the 1970s, neighborhood changes, recipes that filled the kitchen with scents of cardamom and butter. But between domestic entries were other notes. Meetings hosted for community organizers, bail money collected for arrested protesters, neighbors sheltered during hard times. "The house has always been a sanctuary," Margaret had written. "When they wanted to run the expressway through Red Hook, we gathered here. When the factory closed and families needed food, we cooked here. Walls hold more than plaster, they hold witness. The money, according to a note wrapped around it, was an emergency fund for whoever needs the house next. Use it to keep these walls standing. They matter more than you know." Elena counted carefully. The bills were old but legal tender, their value increased by age and condition. Not enough to renovate a fire-damaged house, but enough to fight the first battles. Lawyer fees, permit applications, urgent structural repairs. Outside, voices drifted through the broken window. Brandon Vale again, this time with someone whose clipboard and hard hat suggested official capacity. Their words came in fragments. Structural integrity and blight removal and expedited process. Elena tucked the journal and money back into the box, then slid it into her bag. Sophia replaced the board carefully, patting it down as if tucking in a child. "Should we cover it up again?" she asked, looking at the peeled-back linoleum. Before Elena could answer, a knock sounded at the front door, firm but not threatening. They found Amara from the museum on the stoop, bundled against the cold in a wool coat that smelled of mothballs and coffee. Behind her stood a thin man with salt and pepper beard and round glasses. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Amara said, her breath clouding in the winter air. "This is Professor Chen from the Preservation Department at Pratt. When I mentioned Marvin's collection," she gestured to the man whose eyes crinkled with genuine interest. "Miss Morales," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Marvin Klein's work documented a Brooklyn that's vanishing. I'd like to help ensure his home doesn't vanish as well." They stood in the damaged living room, light filtering through windows and dusty shafts. Professor Chen examined walls and ceilings, making notes in a small book. "The structural elements are sound," he said, tapping a beam. "Fire damage is primarily cosmetic on the first floor. Second floor will need significant work, but it's not beyond salvation." Amara stood beside a wall where photographs had hung, ghostly rectangles marking their absence against the smoke-stained paint. "The museum can expedite the appraisal process," she said. "We have contacts at several galleries who would be interested in showing Marvin's work." The proceeds could fund at least initial repairs. Outside, more neighbors had gathered, curious faces peering through windows, a few bold enough to knock and introduce themselves. Mrs. Vasquez from the bodega brought coffee in paper cups that steamed in the cold air. Mr. Jenkins, a retired electrician who had known Mr. Klein for decades, offered to inspect the wiring once the cleanup began. "Marvin always said this place should stay a home," he told Elena, hands wrapped around his coffee. "Too many buildings around here getting turned into luxury condos nobody from the neighborhood can afford." By afternoon, the kitchen had become an impromptu meeting place. Someone brought folding chairs. Someone else arrived with a box of donuts that powdered fingers with sugar. Professor Chen sketched renovation plans on the back of old envelopes. A law student who lived 2 blocks over researched landmark status possibilities on her laptop. Sophia moved among the adults with quiet confidence, offering water in the few unbroken glasses they'd found in the cupboards. She wore her responsibility like a badge, back straight, eyes solemn. "This is our house," she told each visitor. "We're going to fix it." Brandon Vale appeared as shadows lengthened across the street. He stood on the sidewalk, watching the activity through narrowed eyes. His phone pressed to his ear, voice low but audible in snippets. Complication. Community involvement. Reassess timeline. When he finally approached the door, conversation inside stilled. He stood on the threshold, expensive shoes carefully avoiding debris. Cologne cutting through the lingering smoke smell. His smile remained in place, though it did not reach his eyes. "Quite the gathering," he observed, gaze sweeping over the assembled neighbors. "I wasn't aware you'd obtained permits for this many people in a condemned structure." Elena stepped forward, the deed to the house in one hand, Margaret Klein's journal in the other. "We're assessing, not occupying," she said, voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "And we've found something you should know about." She nodded to Professor Chen, who cleared his throat. "I've submitted preliminary paperwork to the Landmarks Preservation Commission," he said. "This building has historical significance both architecturally and culturally. Marvin Klein's residence and studio represents an important chapter in Brooklyn's photographic documentation." Brandon's smile tightened. "Landmarking takes months, sometimes years. The building poses immediate safety concerns." "Which we're addressing," Amara interjected, stepping forward with her museum card extended. "The Museum of Brooklyn Culture is partnering with Ms. Morales on preservation efforts. We've secured emergency funding for stabilization. It wasn't entirely true, not yet, but the collective will in the room made it feel possible." Brandon took the card reflexively, eyes still fixed on Elena. "This isn't over," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "That house is worth more demolished than preserved." Mathematics always wins. Elena thought of Margaret Klein's journal, of bail money and community meetings, of walls that held witness. Some equations are more complex than they appear, she replied. As Brandon left, Sophia slipped her hand into Elena's. The touch anchored her, small fingers warm against her palm. Through the window, they watched him make a call, gesturing sharply at the gathering inside. "Is he very angry?" Sophia asked. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. "He's disappointed. He thought we would give up." "We won't," Sophia said with absolute certainty. "This is our house now." That night, in their basement apartment, Elena spread photographs and documents across the small table. The curator had brought archival sleeves. For the negatives, each one labeled with careful notes. Professor Chen had left business cards for contractors specializing in historic renovations. The law student had drafted a letter to the buildings department requesting an extension on the demolition notice. Small steps. Not victory, not yet, but movement in its direction. Elena placed Margaret Klein's journal beside Marvin's photographs, two halves of a story coming together after years of separation. Outside, snow began to fall, large flakes illuminated by streetlights. Sophia pressed her face to the window, breath fogging the glass. "It's snowing for real," she said, "not just in the snow globe." The community center off Columbia Street had seen better days. Scuffed linoleum floors squeaked under footsteps. Metal folding chairs shrieked when moved. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one flickering intermittently in the corner like a distress signal. The room smelled of floor polish and the coffee brewing in industrial urns at the back table. Elena sat in the front row, her folder of documents neatly arranged on her lap. Sophia had insisted on wearing her school uniform. Navy jumper, white blouse pressed the night before with Elena's ancient iron that sometimes sparked when plugged in. The girl's hair was braided tightly, ribbon ends tucked away from fidgeting fingers. "How many people are coming?" Sophia whispered, watching the door as neighborhood residents trickled in. Mrs. Ortiz with her teenage grandson, Mr. Jenkins in his electrician's jacket with union patches, young couples in vintage coats alongside elderly residents who had witnessed the neighborhood's multiple reincarnations. "I'm not sure," Elena replied, although the growing crowd exceeded her expectations. Professor Chen had arranged the meeting, sending flyers and emails through his university connections. Amara had brought colleagues from the museum world, their leather portfolios and calculated casualness marking them as visitors to this part of Brooklyn. The wall clock ticked toward 7. Chairs filled, conversations hummed in English, Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, the polyglot soundtrack of Red Hook. At the front of the room, a table held enlarged photographs from Marvin Klein's collection, now professionally matted and labeled. Images of the waterfront from decades past, dock workers' faces lined by sun and labor, children playing in fire hydrant spray during a 1970s heatwave, protesters marching for tenant rights past buildings long since demolished. The door opened again, admitting a cold draft in Brandon Vale. He wore a charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, no tie, an expression of bemused patience. Behind him followed two men in similar attire, one carrying architectural renderings, the other a leather portfolio embossed with the Vale Development logo. Brandon surveyed the room, eyebrows lifting slightly at the turnout. His gaze found Elena, and he offered a small nod. Professional, calculating. Professor Chen called the meeting to order, voice carrying surprisingly well for his slight frame. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We're here to discuss the future of 72 Van Brunt Street and, by extension, the character of this neighborhood." Brandon took a seat near the back, legs crossed at the ankle, phone resting on his knee. His colleagues arranged their materials on empty chairs, ready to present. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded into distance. Amara spoke first, standing beside the displayed photographs. "These images represent more than art. They document a community's identity across decades of change. Marvin Klein's work has been acquired by major institutions, including the Smithsonian and the Brooklyn Museum. His home and studio at 72 Van Brunt Street served as both archive and community space during pivotal moments in this neighborhood's history. Professor Chen followed with a structural assessment, pointing to diagrams showing the building's sound foundation beneath cosmetic damage. The landmark's preservation representative spoke about the building's architectural features, rare for its period and increasingly endangered as development consumed similar structures. When Brandon's turn came, he moved to the front with smooth confidence, unbuttoning his jacket as he faced the room. "I appreciate everyone's enthusiasm," he began, voice modulated for maximum reasonableness. "But sentiment doesn't pay for renovations. The reality is that 72 Van Brunt would require at minimum $300,000 to make habitable again." He gestured to his colleague, who displayed renderings of a gleaming 6-story building with commercial space on the ground floor. Vale Development is prepared to build 20 housing units, with 3 designated as affordable under current regulations. We'll include gallery space that could display Mr. Klein's work permanently, honoring his legacy while providing practical housing solutions. The words sounded generous, reasonable, until Elena looked at the fine print on the plans. Affordable meant still out of reach for most current residents. The gallery space occupied a corner smaller than the average bedroom. The building's footprint extended beyond 72 Van Brunt, suggesting adjacent properties had already been quietly acquired. Questions came from the audience about construction timeline, about truly affordable units, about how many current residents would be displaced by rising property taxes when luxury condos arrived. Brandon fielded each with practiced ease, never quite answering directly, but leaving everyone feeling vaguely reassured. Finally, Elena stood, her folder clutched against her chest. The room quieted. She had rehearsed what to say, practiced in the bathroom mirror while Sophia slept, but words suddenly seemed inadequate against the slick certainty of development plans. "My name is Elena Morales," she began, voice softer than intended. She cleared her throat and started again. "My daughter Sophia and I inherited 72 Van Brunt Street from Marvin Klein because we showed him dignity when he needed it most." She opened the folder, removing Margaret Klein's journal. "This house has been a sanctuary for decades. During the blackout of 1977, neighbors sought shelter there. During the AIDS crisis, community meetings were held in the living room when other venues refused. During Superstorm Sandy, it was a distribution center for supplies." Brandon's smile remained fixed, though something flickered in his eyes. Impatience, perhaps, or recalculation. "Miss Morales," he interjected, "those are lovely anecdotes, but they don't address the financial realities. You simply don't have the resources to—" "I'm not finished," Elena said, her voice finding its strength. The room stilled, surprise rippling through both supporters and skeptics. "Resources are not always measured in your kind of zeros." She placed Marvin's letter on the table, alongside the appraisal of his photographic collection. "The museum exhibition opens next month. The advance from publication rights covers initial renovations." She nodded to Amara, who confirmed with a smile. "The landmark status application has been expedited due to the building's historical significance." Professor Chen stepped forward with a printed list. "We've secured volunteer commitments from contractors, electricians, and plumbers. All local, all invested in preserving neighborhood character. The MAS Pratt Institute's preservation program will document the restoration as a case study, providing additional labor through student involvement." Brandon's colleagues exchanged glances, papers shuffling as they reassessed. Brandon himself maintained his composure, though a muscle tightened along his jaw. "Admirable community spirit," he said, "but partial renovations often reveal more extensive problems. What happens when you've exhausted the photography proceeds and discover structural issues that weren't apparent? What's your backup plan?" Elena hadn't expected this direct challenge. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertainty momentarily stealing her words. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Sophia stood beside her, small fingers finding her mother's hand. "We'll figure it out together," Sophia said, voice clear in the quiet room. "That's what neighbors do." Mrs. Ortiz nodded emphatically. Mr. Jenkins called out, "Damn right," from the back row. A young woman Elena didn't recognize added, "I'm a grant writer. I can help with historic preservation funding applications." The applause began soft, shy as a new flame. Then it grew, chair legs scraping as people stood, palms cracking sharp in the air that smelled of coffee and sugar and something else. Justice, like iron warmed by sun. Brandon's smile had nowhere to go. He lowered his eyes briefly before recovering his professional demeanor. Kasigai, his community sentiment is clear, he said, gathering his materials with deliberate movements. Vale Development will reconsider its approach to this particular property. He extended a business card to Elena. When circumstances change, and they often do, my offer remains open. Elena took the card, meeting his gaze directly. Thank you for your concern, she said, echoing their first interaction at the municipal office. The symmetry wasn't lost on Brandon, whose lips pressed briefly together before he nodded and moved toward the exit. The meeting continued after his departure, shifting from confrontation to planning. A calendar materialized on the wall, volunteer slots filling with names and skills. A retired accountant offered to manage renovation funds. A social media consultant promised to document the process to attract additional support. Someone brought cookies, homemade, still warm, the smell of vanilla and chocolate chips perfuming the room like December. Later, walking home through streets glittering with frost, Sophia skipped ahead, energy undiminished by the late hour. Did we win? She asked, breath clouding in the cold air. Elena considered the question carefully. Not completely, she admitted. Brandon might still find ways to challenge us. Renovations will be difficult and expensive. We might hit problems we can't solve immediately. Sophia nodded, absorbing this reality without distress. But we're not alone anymore. No, Elena agreed, watching her daughter's face in the glow of streetlights. We're not alone. That night, after Sophia fell asleep, Elena sat at their small kitchen table with Margaret Klein's journal open before her. The woman's handwriting flowed across decades, records of neighborhood changes, community struggles, personal losses, and triumphs. In an entry from 1983, Margaret had written, "Power lies not in having enough alone, but in having enough together." Elena traced the words with her fingertip, feeling connected across time to this woman she'd never met, but whose home she would now preserve. Outside, the last bus of the night hissed past their window. The radiator clanked and fell silent. In the stillness, Elena closed her eyes and imagined 72 Van Brunt Street restored. Not to perfection, perhaps, but to function and purpose. Walls repaired, wiring replaced, floors refinished. A home again, but also something more. A continuation. A promise kept. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amara. Museum director approved emergency acquisition fund for remaining photographs. Contract tomorrow. Another message followed from Professor Chen. First student volunteer group confirmed for Saturday. Bringing tools and materials. A third came from a number Elena didn't recognize. This is Jade from the meeting. Sending grant application templates tomorrow. We've got this. Elena placed the phone beside the journal, modern technology alongside handwritten history. The contrast struck her as appropriate somehow. Different methods serving the same essential human need for connection and community. She thought of Brandon Vale, of his confidence momentarily shaken in the community center. He wasn't defeated, not truly. Men like him rarely were by a single setback. But something had shifted tonight in the room's energy, in Elena's own certainty, in the neighborhood's collective will. For the first time since inheriting the house, possibility felt stronger than doubt. The heat clicked on again, pipes gurgling as warmth returned to the radiator. Elena closed the journal gently and stood, muscles aching from the day's tension. Tomorrow would bring paperwork and decisions, contracts and commitments. Tonight, she allowed herself to simply rest in the knowledge that a path had appeared where previously there seemed only walls. In the corner, the snow globe caught moonlight from the window, its miniature cyclone roller coaster standing resilient behind repaired glass. Elena lifted it carefully, the familiar weight comforting in her palm. She shook it gently, watching glitter swirl around Coney Island's tiny landmarks. Even broken things could be mended. Even damaged places could find new purpose. Spring arrived with daffodils in stubborn tree pits and the sound of bicycles ticking past like little clocks marking time. The air along Van Brunt Street smelled of salt and possibility, with undertones of fresh paint and newly cut lumber. Scaffolding embraced 72 Van Brunt like an exoskeleton, protective and transformative. Through open windows drifted the radio's salsa rhythms and occasional bursts of laughter as volunteers worked inside. Elena stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, checking deliveries against budget projections. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, a smudge of primer decorating one cheek like improvised makeup. 4 months had passed since the community meeting, 4 months of permits and inspections, of unexpected challenges and surprising solutions. The winter had been a season of demolition and remediation. Spring brought reconstruction and renewal. "Ma-ha-ah!" Sophia called from the stoop, where she sat with a box of donuts balanced on her knees. "Professor Chen says the electrical inspection is scheduled for tomorrow." Elena made a note on her clipboard, the paper weathered from constant handling. Beside the inspection reminder, she'd drawn a small star, their private symbol marking significant milestones. Each star represented a victory over bureaucracy or physical constraints, a moment when the impossible had yielded to persistence. Inside the house smelled of sawdust and drying plaster, the acrid memory of smoke finally fading from the air. New beams supported the ceiling where fire damage had been most severe, their pale wood standing out against the original structure like fresh scars. The kitchen gleamed with secondhand appliances donated by a restaurant undergoing renovation downtown. Cabinets salvaged from a demolition site in Park Slope had been refinished by art students who'd incorporated subtle details from Marvin Klein's photographs into the woodwork. Mrs. Ortiz supervised a team of neighbors painting the living room walls, a warm ivory that caught the morning light. Her grandson installed window treatments sewn by the quilting circle that met at the community center on Thursdays. In the corner, Mr. Jenkins measured for shelving that would display Marvin's cameras and photography equipment as a permanent installation. "How's the upstairs coming along?" Elena asked Professor Chen, who descended the new staircase with his ever-present notebook. "Remarkably well," he replied, adjusting his round glasses. "The floor has been reinforced, walls are up, and plumbing rough-in is complete. The students are installing insulation today." He smiled, revealing the gap between his front teeth that appeared only when he was genuinely pleased. "Your daughter has been documenting everything with that camera Amara gave her. She has her benefactor's eye for composition." Elena glanced toward the back of the house where Sophia followed a Pratt architecture student, camera in hand, recording each step of the renovation process. The girl moved with increasing confidence through the space, asking questions that revealed her growing understanding of how buildings worked, how homes were made. The museum exhibition had opened in February with a line down the block, the air tasting of pretzels from a nearby cart, and street coffee in paper cups. Elena and Sophia had stood beside Amara as visitors encountered Marvin's images: dock workers, nurses, mothers with strollers pausing to look, to let something brave and complicated move in their chests. A small plaque told about Marvin Klein, about the archive found under the steps, about the woman who inherited a burned house and chose to build a place where stories had heat and shelter. The proceeds from print sales and reproduction rights had covered essential structural repairs. Volunteer labor stretched the budget further. Grants secured by Jade, the grant writer from the community meeting, filled gaps where specialized work couldn't be avoided. The house would never be luxurious, but it was becoming sound, functional, alive with purpose again. Elena hadn't seen Brandon Vale since the meeting, though his presence lingered in the neighborhood like a persistent aftertaste. Construction continued on the block behind Van Brunt Street, where Vale Development had secured permits for a smaller luxury building than originally planned. Occasionally, Elena would spot his colleagues observing 72 Van Brunt's progress from across Sana the street, their expressions unreadable behind sunglasses. "Miss Morales," called a voice from the doorway. Elena turned to find a city inspector with a clipboard that mirrored her own. "I'm here for the preliminary occupancy assessment." Elena led the woman through each room, answering questions about fire exits and smoke detectors, About insulation ratings and plumbing fixtures? The inspector made notes without commentary, her pen scratching against paper the only indication of her thoughts. In the kitchen, they paused before a wall where Margaret Klein's journal entries had been framed and mounted, selected passages preserved behind glass. Decades of observation and resilience visible to all who entered. The inspector read them silently, her official demeanor softening momentarily. "My grandmother lived in this neighborhood," she said unexpectedly. "She used to talk about a photographer who documented the longshoremen's strike in '64. Wonder if it was your Mr. Klein." "Probably," Elena replied, surprised by this personal connection. Most of his work focused on labor movements and community activism. The inspector nodded, then returned to her checklist with renewed efficiency. When she reached the final page, she signed with a flourish. "You'll need a final inspection once the second floor is complete, but this authorizes partial occupancy of the first floor, effective immediately." Elena accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the milestone they represented. "Don't thank me," the inspector replied, closing her folder. "This is by the book." "You've done the work." She glanced around the room once more before leaving, her official shoes clicking against the new floorboards. The news spread quickly through the house. Cheers erupted from the painting crew. Mr. Jenkins performed an impromptu dance with his measuring tape. Sophia rushed to Elena's side, camera clutched against her chest. "Does this mean we can live here now?" she asked, eyes wide with possibility. "Soon," Elena promised. "Very soon." That afternoon, a delivery truck arrived with furniture donated by a hotel undergoing renovation. Simple pieces with clean lines and minimal wear. Volunteers carried in beds and tables, lamps and chairs, arranging them according to the floor plan Professor Chen's students had designed. By evening, the first floor resembled a home rather than a construction site. As twilight gathered, most volunteers departed with promises to return the following day. Elena and Sophia remained, sitting on the front stoop as darkness settled over the neighborhood. The air had cooled, carrying sense of someone's dinner cooking nearby, garlic and tomatoes, comfort made tangible. "It doesn't look the same as before the fire," Sophia observed, leaning against Elena's shoulder. "No," Elena agreed. "Some things couldn't be saved. But we kept what mattered most." A figure approached along the sidewalk, familiar in stance, though unexpected in this moment. Brandon Vale walked alone, without assistance or architectural renderings. He wore casual clothes, rather than his usual suit, hands tucked into jacket pockets against the evening chill. Elena felt herself tense, protective instincts rising. Sophia straightened beside her, small face solemn as she regarded the developer who had once dismissed their claim to this place. Brandon stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the house with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Not quite regret, not exactly admiration, but something that acknowledged the reality before him. "Miss Morales," he said, voice lacking its usual polish. "I was driving by and saw the progress." He gestured toward the scaffolding, the new windows, the freshly painted door. "It's impressive what you've accomplished." Elena nodded, unsure how to respond to this unexpected acknowledgement. Sophia watched with curious eyes, her camera forgotten in her lap. Brandon shifted his weight, uncharacteristically awkward. "I misjudged you," he admitted, words careful like fragile cups. "I misjudged what matters here." He extended a hand, the gesture both professional and oddly vulnerable. Elena considered him for a moment. This man who had once laughed at her ambition, who had calculated her failure as inevitable. She saw now something she'd missed before. Beneath the confidence and cologne, a certain loneliness, a hunger for something that had nothing to do with property values. She took his hand for a heartbeat, human to human, and released it with a nod. "Thank you for saying that." He stepped back, boundaries reestablished. "Vale Development is moving forward with the Garfield Street project," he said, business tone returning. "But we've revised the plans to include more affordable units and community space. Your success here has been instructive." With that, he continued down the street, figure gradually blending with evening shadows. Elena watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor animosity, Just the quiet recognition that transformation sometimes extended beyond walls and wiring to touch even those who seemed most resistant. Later, as stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky visible between buildings, Elena and Sophia stood in what would become their living room. The space was painted but still empty, awaiting furniture that would arrive tomorrow. Through the window, streetlights cast gentle patterns across the floor. "Can we sleep here tonight?" Sophia asked, her voice hushed as if in church. "Even though it's not completely ready?" Elena considered the inspector's partial occupancy permit, the functioning bathroom, the security of new locks on solid doors. "Yes," she decided. "We can bring sleeping bags." Like camping. Sophia's face brightened with delight. They retrieved necessities from the basement apartment, sleeping bags, toothbrushes, a change of clothes, and returned to Van Brunt Street as night fully claimed the city. The house creaked and settled around them. It sounds unfamiliar, yet welcoming. In the empty living room, they unrolled sleeping bags beneath the window. Sophia placed the snow globe, now repaired, on the windowsill where moonlight caught its glass surface. "It looks right here," she said with satisfaction. Elena agreed, watching the miniature Coney Island catch the light, its tiny cyclone roller coaster, standing proud against the backdrop of Brooklyn's actual skyline visible in the distance. The snow globe had been among the first things they'd rescued from the basement apartment, carrying it carefully to its new home like a talisman. Sophia crawled into her sleeping bag, eyelids growing heavy despite her excitement. "Mom," she said, voice soft as felt in the quiet room, "did the house save us, or did we save the house?" Elena smiled, stroking her daughter's hair as streetlight cast gentle shadows across their temporary bed. "Maybe both," she said. "Maybe that's how homes begin." They lay in the golden hush of their first night home, the repaired snow globe catching moonbeams and sending quiet reflections across walls that had survived fire and neglect to shelter them now. Elena breathed in wood, paper, and the faintest trace of ash, what remains when fire has already done its worst. Morning arrived with sunlight pouring through windows without curtains, painting warm rectangles across the floor where they had slept. Sophia woke first, her excitement propelling her through the house to check each room as if confirming it hadn't disappeared overnight. Elena followed more slowly, savoring the feeling of waking in this space that had transformed from inheritance to burden to gift. Through the front window, she watched neighbors beginning their day, the bodega owner unlocking his gate. School children, with backpacks hurrying past, an elderly couple walking a small dog who paused to sniff at the newly planted flowers in the tree pit outside. The day promised activity. Volunteers would arrive by 9, deliveries were scheduled throughout the morning, decisions about fixtures and finishes awaited her attention. But for this moment, Helena stood still in the center of the house that had become a center for so much more than herself and Sophia. On the wall beside her hung Marvin Klein's favorite photograph. A nurse's hands tying a protest sign at dawn, her breath a white ribbon in cold air, her eyes full of tomorrow. Beside it now hung a new image. Sophia's first developed photograph showing the community members gathered on the stoop, tools in hand, faces determined and hopeful on the day renovations began. From the kitchen came the sound of Sophia filling a kettle, their first breakfast in this new old home about to begin. Elena moved toward her daughter's voice, each step carrying the certainty that had grown from scattered seeds of community into this flowering of possibility. True wealth, she thought as she joined Sophia in the sunlit kitchen, is the kind you can't see on a balance sheet, the kind that multiplies when shared, that grows in soil others might abandon, the kind that builds homes from houses and family from strangers, and future from what might have been only ash.